I'm joined by my colleague, Nick Bagley, who's a professor of law at the University of Michigan. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about healthcare. And why don't you just start off by telling us, healthcare reform is everywhere. What's actually in play in the discussion of healthcare reform?
Primarily what we're talking about in recent years have been Republican efforts to undo the Affordable Care Act, which is the 2010 statute that President Obama enacted that extended healthcare coverage to many of the poor and uninsured.
One of the topics for this teach out is does it make sense to think about healthcare as a civil right? And so let's just start there. What do you think?
Yeah, well, during the controversy over its adoption, the Affordable Care Act wasn't really billed as a civil rights statute. And you could have billed it that way if you wanted to. The biggest reason that people go uninsured in this country is because health insurance is extraordinarily expensive. So in 2017, the average price of health care coverage through an employer was $19,000 for a family. $19,000 is well beyond the reach of a whole lot of poor and middle class families. So what the Affordable Care Act had to do was essentially transfer resources from taxpayers in general towards people who lacked insurance, who are disproportionately quite poor. People in this country who are disproportionately quite poor are also disproportionately members of underrepresented minority groups. So just to give you some sense of what that looks like, prior to the Affordable Care Act's adoption, about 1 in 8 white Americans lacked health insurance. And that figure was 1 in 5 African Americans and 1 in 3 Latinos lacked insurance. So massive disparities in the rate of uninsurance, which meant that the primary beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act were Black and Latino people. But we still didn't talk about it as if it was a civil rights statute. We framed the debate over the access to health insurance as something that everyone was entitled to, regardless of your color or creed or anything else. And I think,
but that's true, right?
It was certainly the way that the political rhetoric worked. It was framed as a right that was a universal right. Mm-hmm. And I think it was important to the political debate that it was framed as a universal right. And I think some of the dynamics that we've witnessed since the adoption of the Affordable Care Act are hard to understand without seeing it as against the backdrop of the racialized politics in our country. So the Affordable Care Act is enacted in 2010, and one of the big things it does is expand the Medicaid program for very poor people to cover everybody up to 138% of the poverty level. So okay. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid was available only to certain categories of people, and even then only if you had sometimes no income at all. So expanding Medicaid is going to bring a lot of poor people into the program. And initially the idea was that Medicaid would be expanded, that every single state in the country would expand Medicaid. But in 2012, the Supreme Court decided a case that said, we understand that what Congress wanted to do was expand Medicaid everywhere, but we think the states should have a role in deciding whether to expand their Medicaid programs in their states. And that choice gave states an opportunity to reflect about whether they wanted to help everybody at the lower end of the income spectrum out. And there's a lot of money at stake because the federal government is the one that's financing the vast majority of the Medicaid expenditures, about 90% of the bill.
So the question for the states was, did they want to participate in this program that the federal government would pay for?
Yeah, exactly. In other words, you have all these poor people. The federal government is willing to pay for almost all of their health insurance. Do you want to take them up on that offer?
Okay.
And 31 states so far have said, yes, absolutely, we want to take them up on that offer because it's hundreds of millions of dollars that would otherwise not flow into the states. But there are 19 holdout states that have said, I know you want to shower money on us, federal government, but we refuse to have any part in Obamacare. And it is, I think, telling that those states are concentrated in the South and in the Plain states. And these are the states that have resisted most staunchly are some of those states with some of our darkest sort of racial history in this country. Mm-hmm. And it leads you to wonder if at least some of the resistance to the Affordable Care Act, which has taken on the aspect of a holy war, something that we haven't seen, in fact, since Southern resistance to the civil rights statutes, it's hard to resist the conclusion that maybe race is playing a role, at least in the background, that maybe in some states the notion of extending a helping hand to people who don't look like you or come from the same place as you is less appealing than it might be in other states where those sorts of racial politics are not as prominent.
So how is that Medicaid expansion question the same or different than the Medicare expansion that was a generation or two ago?
Yeah, well, so the beneficiary...
And let me pause for one moment. Just for people who aren't completely familiar with the difference between Medicaid and Medicare, perhaps you could explain that.
So Medicare is the program for the elderly and the disabled. So people over the age of 65 or who have a qualifying disability get their health insurance covered by the federal government. And Medicare and Medicaid were adopted in 1965 side by side. But Medicare is not a program that disproportionately aids people of, at the lower end of the income spectrum. It's available universally. Mm-hmm. And its universal entitlement means that it's much, it doesn't have the same kind of racial politics behind it. Nobody looks at Medicare and thinks that's a program that's designed to help somebody who looks different than me. Everybody's got a grandma or a grandpa who is on Medicare. Medicaid is different. Medicaid is or can be about other people that maybe you don't know, or people from a different community than you. And in that sense, I think Medicaid triggers lots of questions about how generous are we willing to be? And especially as soon as you say, how generous are you willing to be to somebody of a different ethnic background than you, or a different racial background than you? Those questions are kind of brought to the fore. You remember, all of us are contributing our taxpayer dollars to this common fund, and we have to decide how to divvy it up. And everybody would like a little bit more. And so part of what we do as a democracy is fight over who gets access to those taxpayer dollars. And in the Medicare context, we're comfortable saying, if you're older or if you're disabled, we're willing to help you out. In the Medicaid context, we're still fighting about how generous we want to be to the poorest among us.
Do you think it's an analytically sound move to talk about healthcare as a right? Or is that just a rhetorical move, a strategic move?
I'm conflicted about this question. I think it's easy to characterize healthcare as a right, which is to say a claim that we make against the government and that you're entitled to no matter what. At the same time, I wonder about putting healthcare on the same plane as a right to free speech or a right to education. Because I wonder, because healthcare is so expensive in this country, and we have so many other things we could do with our money. And so if you say healthcare is a right, and that right is graven in stone, what we're saying is that money is off limits for any other purpose at all. And I don't know that we've had the conversation, a kind of conversation where I'd be comfortable saying we've ruled out all other potential uses of that money. So I think it's rhetorically useful to call it a right. And I think it's a gesture towards the importance that healthcare has in our society. But the notion that we can't have a conversation about what that right ought to be, or really how generous we should be with respect to that right, I think that might be a little bit off. I will say, though, that the rights framing has done it's done a lot of work in this debate. The Affordable Care Act's adoption was driven by a lot of people who felt like healthcare is a right. But more importantly, the failure of Republican efforts to undo the Affordable Care Act has a lot to do with the fact that at this point, it's really hard for a politician to stand up and say, you don't have a right to health care. Republicans, when they're moving to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, say lots of things about how terrible the act is and what they think they could do better. But what they don't say is, we don't believe everybody is entitled to health insurance. Some of their bills seem to suggest that they're not committed to that principle, but they never say it. And I think the gap between what they're willing to say publicly and the content of what they actually put on the table as a proposal is really what doomed their efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act.
So one more question about the same thing. Are you more comfortable with the rights frame, say, for people with disabilities, who are among the primary groups who are asserting a right to healthcare as a civil right? They do, ADAPT does die-ins, and they use civil rights strategies. And another segment of this teach-out is going to be an interview with people who use those kinds of strategies. So I guess, is that the same, but more so, or is that different?
Well, maybe one way of thinking about it is it depends on what level of generality you define the right. So I think there'd be widespread agreement, and I have no problem with this claim that everyone has a right to health care. Every disabled member of our community has a right to accommodations and to the kind of help they need to be a flourishing member of our community. But then once you've articulated that at the general level, moving down to brass tacks and asking what sorts of resources are we willing to commit to vindicate those rights is a much more difficult question. And I don't know how helpful it is to characterize, to invoke the rights language when you're hashing that question out. So you might say the rights language gives you some additional oomph in asking for a larger slice of the pot of resources. And maybe that's true. But I think, for me at least, the question is not one of, is this a right or isn't this a right? The question is, what do we think, given our available resources, we owe to one another? And the answer, I think, is that we owe a fairly robust set of obligations. But that may not be, what I think is at the core of what the healthcare right might entail might not be what somebody else thinks. And I think that's okay. And I think we have to have that conversation conscious of what we're trading it off against.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting conversation. And I hope that you'll join us on the next part of this Teach Out.